In the last video, we talked about the events that were occurring in and around Corinth. And of course, the Spartan task force, along with a group of Corinthian exiles, seized and garrisoned the key port of Latium. They also ripped down a portion of the wall that connected Corinth to Latium. Now, shortly after those events in 392 BC, the Spartans dispatched an ambassador to the Persian satrap, hoping to turn the Persians against the Athenians and in turn sign a peace treaty with Persia. The Spartan envoy warned the Persians that the Athenians were up to no good, and in the process of rebuilding their empire, especially after Conon restored the Athenian fleet. The Athenians, for their part, also sent envoys to counter the Spartans' claims. Even Conon was part of the contingent the Athenians sent. Eventually, nothing came of the conference, but the Persian satrap Tiribasis had Conon arrested and also secretly provided the Spartans with money to rebuild their fleet. Conon, however, soon escaped, but he died a short time later on Cyprus. When the Persian king learned that Tiribasis had provided funds to the Spartans, he removed Tiribasis and replaced him with Struthos. Struthos, in turn, pursued an aggressive anti-Spartan policy. As a result, the Spartans dispatched Thibron with orders to attack Struthos. Although Thibron enjoyed some early success, he was eventually routed and killed. Now, back in mainland Greece, all sides simply bolstered their various garrisons. The Greek allies continued to keep their main base at Corinth, and the Spartans continued to maintain their garrison at Sicyon while maintaining control of Latium. Xenophon indicates that both sides began to hire out mercenary troops. It is here that Xenophon mentions an interesting character during this time period, Iphicrates. The Athenians had dispatched Iphicrates to assist in garrisoning Corinth. Iphicrates was an Athenian general who made numerous improvements to the peltas, or light-armed mercenaries. They were named after their small pelte shield. So what were these reforms? First, he increased the length of the spears and swords. Iphicrates also reduced the amount of defensive armor by replacing the heavier bronze plate with a linen cuirass. A lighter shield was used as well. This was the smaller pelte shield. The metal footwear was removed altogether and replaced by leather sandals. I think it can be fairly said that Iphicrates had a huge impact on the Macedonian army decades later. These reforms allowed his troops to increase the speed of their movements, and critically, the formation was less centered on defense and much more on offense. With his reforms in place, Iphicrates decided to conduct what Xenophon called a system of guerrilla warfare. I should also mention that Iphicrates seemed to have possessed a ridiculous amount of confidence, given that his light troops would be taking on the terrifying Spartan heavy infantry. The first target of Iphicrates was the city of Phlius. The peltas caused such mayhem that Phlius had no alternative but to seek help from the Spartans. Now, this was a tricky situation because Phlius, since like many Greek cities, had this perpetual tension between democrats and oligarchs. The democrats eventually won out and exiled all of the oligarchs. But now these same democrats were asking for Sparta's help. So there was a well-placed fear that the Spartans were sympathetic to the exiled oligarchs, and just perhaps they would seek to restore them. The Spartans arrived to stabilize the situation at Phlius, and according to Xenophon, soon departed without restoring the exiles. Still, Iphicrates wasn't about to stop. He and his peltas continued on with their incursions. They ravaged Arcadia, launching raid after raid on several fortified posts. Apparently, the Arcadian hoplites refused to fight against this new style of warfare. The Spartans, on the other hand, were not as easily terrified of these light troops, and according to Xenophon, said, quote, stand in as much awe of these peltas as children of the hobgoblins of their nurses. The Spartans backed this talk up by marching right up to the city of Corinth. The Athenians, with the Spartans at the doorstep of Corinth, decided to rebuild the walls that had been ripped down earlier by Praxiteles. And amazingly, they did just that and repaired the wall in just a few days. The Spartans decided to head south now and ravage the lands around Argos. This would destroy their all-important harvest. They were led by the Spartan king Agesilaus. After this little venture was completed, the Spartans once again marched on Corinth and retook the walls which had been so hastily rebuilt by the Athenians. With these successes, Agesilaus decided to disband his army for the time being. 1 year later, in 390 BC, the Spartans were once again on the move, and once again the expedition was led by Agesilaus. This time, Agesilaus bypassed Corinth altogether and marched right into the Isthmus. Here he found the Argives participating in the Isthmian Games. Before the game started, the Argives were about to prepare a sacrifice in a nearby temple. But upon seeing the Spartans, the Argives retreated. Agesilaus decided to complete the sacrifice himself, which must have been a tremendous insult to the Argives. But after the Spartans left, the Argives continued on with the Isthmian Games. After all, the games must go on. Agesilaus wasn't finished in the Isthmus, though. He moved his army against Pyrrhum. Pyrrhum was an important food supply for Corinth. So important that the Corinthians sought the help of Iphicrates. Iphicrates and his peltasts slipped past Agesilaus under the cover of darkness. Despite this, the citizens of Pyrrhum lost heart and abandoned the city. Agesilaus and his forces then proceeded to lay waste to the countryside, capturing towns and seizing the harvest from the various farmsteads. Prisoners were taken and many were sold into slavery. After all of these setbacks, the Allies were largely confined to Corinth, with much of the surrounding countryside and towns controlled by the Spartans. Meanwhile, Iphicrates returned back to Corinth. With the situation looking dire, an opportunity arose for Iphicrates. A Spartan Mora, which was a regiment of 600 men, was returning to Latium. This meant they had to march right past Corinth. The Athenians decided to confront this lone Mora, especially since the bulk of the Spartan army was located in the Isthmus. The Athenians confronted the Spartans with some hoplites, and of course with Iphicrates and his peltasts. Iphicrates was confident that his light troops could hang with the Spartan heavy infantry. That speed alone could cause numerous problems for the slower and heavily armed Spartan hoplites. The Athenian heavy infantry drew up in formation just outside Corinth, while the light troops gave chase to the Spartan Mora. The Spartan commander ordered some of his heavy infantry to charge this light infantry, but the peltasts simply fell back. Once the Spartans turned to head back to the Mora, the peltasts let loose their javelins. The Spartans suffered severe casualties, but nonetheless the Spartans ordered yet another charge, only to suffer the same result. Again and again the Spartans would charge, and then the peltasts would retreat, but the range of the javelins continually hampered the Spartans' charge, such that they could not get into close quarters, where the Spartan hoplites were unbeatable. The Spartans were losing more and more men with each failed charge. Xenophon indicates that all this nonsense wore down the Spartans and emboldened the successful peltasts. With the Spartans in such a weakened state, the Athenians advanced with their own heavy infantry, and with that the Spartans took flight. Despite the arrival of cavalry units, the Spartans were driven back to a hilltop overlooking Latium. The soldiers in Latium sailed out of the port in small boats to rescue the beleaguered Spartans. The Spartans made a break for it and ran for the boats, and all the time they were hotly pursued by the peltasts. At the end of the day, the Spartans lost 250 of the 600 men in the Mora. For Sparta, this was a staggering loss since the number of Spartiates had been declining for decades. Agesilaus was still in the Isthmus when he received word of the disaster at Latium. In a state of shock, he decided to head back to Sparta, but left some troops behind to garrison Latium. Meanwhile, Iphicrates recovered some of the towns that Agesilaus had captured. Despite the reversals for Sparta, Latium continued to hold out, although their supply route was now blocked by land after the destruction of the Spartan Mora. They were still able to keep the garrison supplied by sea, since the Spartans now had control of the Corinthian Gulf. Nonetheless, for the rest of the Corinthian War, the Spartans would be unable to pursue an aggressive policy deep inside Corinthian territory.